Hi there, I'm Nic Watt. As you can see beside me, I'm a UX designer, and this is part 3 of the series of presentations I'm doing with the RetroArch team, and to try and look at how their UI works at the moment and potentially suggest some UI and UX improvements that could be done there. So I'm going to jump straight over to the slide deck and we can get going. So this is the slide deck that I prepared. If you've seen the other videos, you'll always be familiar with this. The goal, first of all, is to try and get a holistic or better holistic understanding of how RetroArch's current UX and UI work, and then look at the positives and negatives, and then I'm going to try and take that into potentially Figma or something in the future to suggest improvements there for the team. So the previous videos that we've done, the first one was on personas, the second one was on metaphors, and today's one's going to be on user journeys. Spelling error, I will fix that later. So user journeys are what I like to think of as the way a user moves through your application, or the route that they might take to solve a particular problem or to accomplish a particular task. And it's worth noting that the more steps a user has to take and the more choices that we give them along that route, potentially the more difficult it becomes, the more confused they become, and either worst case scenario, they become lost, or they do the wrong thing, or they make a mistake. And the very, very worst thing is that they decide that they don't like our application and then stop using it altogether. And obviously in applications where there's a large competitive space, that's what happens, right? People just stop using one and start moving to another. So it's important to recognize these, and I'm not today going to go over every single user journey in RetroArch, but I'm going to call out a couple of examples just so we can discuss them. And then these would be the sorts of things that I'll be looking at as I start to suggest improvements to the UI. So most users, when they come to an application, have a need, right? You choose to launch an application because you want to do something. That might be, I want to pay my bill, right? It's a banking app, perhaps. It might be, I want to order new shoes, and that's why you've launched Amazon. It might be, I want to listen to music, and that's why you've launched Spotify or iTunes or Apple Music. And in our case, it might be, I want to play a game, or I want to play or use an app that only exists in a DOSBox emulator or whatever, right? Now, as we can see here by the diagram, an app that's got very few steps and they're very clear what's happening along the road, on the road or the route, will end usually with a happy user, right? I paid my bill, yay, I can get on with my life, right? And one that has more steps will ultimately lead to a frustrated user. Now, I've put 6 steps here, but there's a magic number somewhere between good and dreadful. And that will vary a little bit from user to user, but generally speaking, the more steps there are, the more likely people will become impatient and frustrated. We've also got to recognize that some of us are very good at understanding kind of spatially where we are, both in real life, when it comes to reading a map, but also in terms of software, in terms of like where we are in the app and what we're doing at the current moment. And some users, and I'm sure we've all got friends or family who are like this, are very bad at being able to visualize where they are, and you would never give them a map to do directions with if you were going on a hike with them, let's say, right? And that can be the same, maybe not for the same people, but that can be the same. Some people find it very difficult in an app to hold on to where they're kind of physically located in the app at any given time, right? And so as part of my skill set and part of the UX and UI discipline is to try and help that, or help the team when we come to design these user interfaces, right? And I think it's still worth pointing out here at this moment that making a good user journey doesn't necessarily mean that you have to remove features, and it also doesn't have to mean that you dumb down an application. A lot of this is about the visual hierarchy of information, and a lot of it is about where you place the information so that your different types of users, we've already done that in our personas, right? We've got novices all the way up to experts and developers. Your different types of users will read a screen differently and will get different information out of it. And we'll be able to do different things. So this is why you can have, say, advanced settings. This is why you can have additional options. But you'll use visual hierarchy and the way humans naturally, predominantly, read from top to bottom to make sure that your novice users get what they need quite quickly and that potentially your advanced users or your expert users can take in more information and make more salient decisions. And you can kind of branch them off if need be. So the second example we've got here is where you start to give the user examples. So as we can see in the previous one, there were just linear steps, right? That was just about time and being frustrated. This second one is much more about when you give user choices. Now, obviously, the first one, there's no user choices still, and that's, yay, that was easy. The second example has lots of choices. It's a ridiculous example potentially, but there's various choices that the user can make, and some of those choices take the user back one or more steps, right? And that happens. There's plenty of times there's websites we go to that I'm sure all of us can think of, or apps we use, where if you don't quite know how to use it, you end up going back way too many steps. And you're like, oh, the app's just quit on me, or oh, I'm back on splash screen, why did that happen? And that ends up to a frustrating user, right? Because the example I use is if you imagine your app or our app being a maze, and if you come into a maze and you can see the exit straight in front of you, then it's obviously it's not fulfilled its job of being a good maze, but it's very easy to get out of, right? And that's kind of what we want out of the first example, is I'm in the maze and I can see where I'm going and I can get out really easily, job done, right? I've paid my bill or I've run the game. But the more corners and more junctions that a maze has, it obviously makes it way more complicated to get out of, right? And that's great if the whole purpose of it is to be a maze, but for software, it's probably not great, right? Because when you get to a junction, you look left or right in the maze, they both look the same, right? A well-designed maze, they both look the same. And so now I'm only going to be able to make a good choice, either by guesswork or by prior knowledge, right? So either I understand the rules of how mazes work or I've been here before. And that's kind of what we want to try and avoid, right? Because if every time I get to a choice, I have to guess, particularly if I'm a new user, then one, there's a dice roll that I might get it wrong. And if it's a 50-50 choice and one of them is categorically wrong, then it's 50% of the time most users will get it wrong, right? And these are the things that add up to frustration, because what you don't want to do is make your users feel dumb, right? What we want to try and do is give them enough information so that at the end of the day, they come away at least going, well, you know, I made bad choices, but I was given the right information. And it's a little bit like video games, right? If you ever watched any of Shigeru Miyamoto's discussions on like how they design Mario and stuff, is that they always want the side-scrolling Mario games for the player to feel like they failed because they made a mistake, not because the game did something wrong, as it were, right? Like if they got shot from off screen and died and they're like, oh, I don't understand why I just died, that's not what they want in Mario, and so it doesn't happen. Whereas if I fall down a pit, it's like, oh, I fell down a pit because I was bad at jumping, right? I need to get better at that. And these are the things that when we're doing software, we need to be cognizant of, and making sure that if there is a choice, and if the player has to, or the user has to do something, that we make sure we give them the right information so that they can make a well-informed decision. And they're like, oh yeah, right, cool, I'm confident in my choice now. And if there's a mistake or an error, that we give them good feedback so that they know next time how to do it correctly or to fix the mistake, right? And Mario's another good example is, you fall down a pit, you die, you're like, maybe I don't want to fall down pits anymore, I'll try and jump better, right? And that's what we want out of our app, right? Oh, this happened, we couldn't find X, but let's give you some information that maybe will help you next time so that you can avoid this pitfall or this mistake, right? So for RetroArch specifically, there's a huge number of use cases, right? I mean, it's a great app. It's got loads and loads of sophistication. It can do an awful lot, which is both good and bad, right? It's great that it's got a huge feature set, but that's also the challenge about giving a UI that's kind of cohesive for people, easy to learn, but maybe hard to master. And I think that's a really interesting kind of point to think about, is that the goal of a good user interface is that easy to learn, but potentially harder to master kind of goal, right? And that's where I would like to see us try and massage RetroArch, is that everyone should be able to use it, but it has depth that requires, over time, you can accumulate knowledge and be much, get much more out of RetroArch, right, than maybe it superficially initially appears at. Whereas at the moment, you're very much presented with a get good or get out kind of style interface where it's just overwhelming and there's a lot of choices. So anyway, back to user journeys. I've listed a few examples of what I consider tasks. Now, tasks are the things that a user's coming to an application with in order to use it, right? They've chosen to boot it up today because I want to play a ROM, right? I want to play a particular game. Or boot it up today because I want to create a collection of my retro games that I already have, right? And so on and so forth. And it's these tasks that then lead to the specific user journeys, and therefore the flow of the steps that the user must go to accomplish that task, okay? And it's important that we think about these because, as we've already mentioned, if I've come to RetroArch today to play a game and it takes me, 100 button clicks to be able to get to that point and 3 minutes, I'm potentially going to slowly get frustrated by using it, right? And that's an exaggerated example, obviously. But if each task I do comes at a level of complexity that makes me feel less confident about myself and or less confident about RetroArch, then potentially my confidence gets chipped away to such a point that I just stop using it or try not to touch it unless I really need to. Now, what is the difference between a task like play a game and I want to set up RetroArch, right? So it's a really critical point that we understand is that big general concepts like I want to set up RetroArch sound like they're a task, right? And sound like they're similar to I play a ROM name, but I'm fairly confident that most people don't come to RetroArch just to set it up and then never ever use it, right? That's not a goal. The goal is I want to set up RetroArch so that I can play, a retro game of my choice or run something in a DOS box or whatever, right? Or I want to set up RetroArch so that I can have all of my retro games collection playable, okay? And so that's why we've got to be really careful at the user journey is not, I want to set up RetroArch. The user journey is I want to do this task, and to do this task, I need to set up parts or some or all of RetroArch, right? Particularly first time. Or I want to do this task, and so on and so forth. And the reason also for that is that if we go down the rabbit hole of big tasks like that, we agglomerate a whole bunch of subtasks into one big one, then our user journey becomes crazy complicated and crazy big, and it's very difficult to break it down into stages that are very, very simple. So it's definitely worth keeping that in mind. Excuse me. So here's one of the first examples that I built a kind of rough user journey out of. Now, obviously, I'm doing these as diagrams. If we were to do this fully, then I would have to try, particularly looking at it currently, list every single screen that you could go onto, but that's going to take up way too much screen real estate to make it readable and understandable for these presentations. So I've tried to paraphrase where possible, and you'll see. Hopefully you can track my mouse around the screen. So we start on the left-hand side here, right? And the goal of this user journey is that a user has downloaded, I'm assuming that they've successfully downloaded and installed RetroArch on their chosen platform, right? That's a whole other set of user journeys that will vary from platform to platform that I'm not taking into consideration for the moment. I'm just assuming that that's happened. But this is assuming after the user has successfully installed RetroArch, their first potentially or a choice or task that they want to accomplish is I want to play, a particular game, right? And so that's the thought bubble here. And then the first thing that they have to do is they have to run RetroArch. So they double click on RetroArch or they launch it from whatever launcher. And that brings them to their main menu. right? I'm actually going to flick over in a minute, hopefully, and show you me trying to do some of this to talk through it as well, so we can kind of do it and go over the flow kind of twice. So you run RetroArch. And RetroArch by default, which I'm not actually sure why, but it comes to what it likes to call the main menu. Now, the main menu doesn't really present you with anything to do with playing games. So if you, on the right here, choose any of the main menu options, then that's a red herring, right? You're not getting anywhere closer to playing a game, with potentially the exception of if you rabbit hole enough, you can install a core, but you still need to go and create a playlist. So at some point, if you take that side adventure, you have to come back to the sidebar, right? Or already know to navigate down to the sidebar. Now, the interesting thing about the visual hierarchy, which I'll go into a little bit more, is that the main menu and the sidebar presented is the same thing. So it's not immediately obvious necessarily that that's what you need to do to be able to access the sidebar's additional list of options, one of which is the plus, where you can add content, right? So there's a whole bunch of other options that come installed by default for RetroArch, but they're all red herrings to playing a game as well. And what you need to do is go to, like, I think it's like a playlist or import content, whatever it's called. So you click there, and then that takes you to another screen, and you've got 3 choices. Now, these 3 choices, if you just want to play one game, maybe you've only got one ROM, that's all you want to do. These choices can be a little bit unclear and also potential red herrings. So you probably just want to scan that one file if you've just got one game. So you can scan directory, right? It's a partial red herring because potentially there's other stuff in that directory. Maybe you just, it's in your, like, I don't know, documents folder or whatever. And it's just scanning a whole bunch of stuff unnecessarily, right? If you scan a file, you're scanning that particular file. If you do a manual scan, then that gives, it's a red herring in many ways because you're not going to get thumbnails and a whole bunch of other stuff. And you're going to have to read a whole bunch of technical things that you probably weren't prepared for. So what's also interesting is, regardless of which one you go down, once you actually scan the file, nothing happens. So it will pop up a little notification in the bottom left-hand corner, but you're not taken to the playlist that's created. You're not taken to a screen that tells you a playlist is created. You're not given any information that anything's happened. So you're now just sitting on the same screen in the folder that you chose, and you have to make a very big leap, which is why these are now dotted, to the fact that a playlist is being created, right? And so then you have to back all the way out to the sidebar, go down to the playlist, right? Choose the playlist, choose the game, and you still can't play it. So you have to now choose a core, and then once you've chosen a core, you can then run the game. And so for a first-time user, there's a lot. This is probably the biggest learning curve that a user has to make, right? And this would be the same or similar if they wanted to import loads of games, right? Maybe they've got an entire platform or a whole collection, whatever it is, right? So scan directory would be the one they'd want to do, and wouldn't be the red herring in that case. Scan file and manual scan would probably be the red herrings there, but it's a similar result, right? A playlist or multiple playlists would be created, and the user is still none the wiser that that's happened, and then they still need to go to the sidebar and then make a big jump to the fact that they need to select a core. So I might try jumping over to RetroArch now. Let me see if I can do that. So we've got RetroArch on the screen now, and you can see here that this is the landing screen for RetroArch. So you get brought to the main menu, and it's not immediately apparent, particularly I guess for novice and new users, what's going on here and why I've been brought here. It's not giving you any signals as to how to actually start to add games or launch them or anything, and you have to take a leap of judgment. You actually have to press back if you're on a controller and then navigate down. So obviously I've got playlists below here, I've already added them, but for a new user they wouldn't be there. And there's actually I've turned a bunch of features off. There's a bunch of additional features in between adding, like importing content and the main menu. So there's quite a lot to kind of navigate and take in. So once the user has worked out how to get here, they then have to make a choice on what they want to do. So if they just want to play a particular game and that's all they want to do, then they probably need to choose scan file. If they want to add a whole bunch, then they need to choose scan directory. And then manual scan, I'm learning through communicating with the team, is a little bit of a red herring for most people, and that you probably don't want to do that unless you really, really, really have to. Because scan directory is the one that will mainly get your thumbnails, etc. So let's say the user chooses to scan a directory. They would then browse to a path and then go into their games folder, and then they would choose to scan that directory, right? Now I've already done this, but if you run it, a bunch of stuff happens in the bottom left, as you can see there, and then nothing happens once this finishes. So we'll watch this. I must have chosen too big a folder. Okay, so that's done, right? Now, as far as RetroArch is concerned, a playlist has been created. As far as the user is concerned, it did a bunch of stuff, but has anything actually happened? Don't know, right? There's nothing that informs the user at this point that a playlist has been created, and it doesn't take you to the playlist, and it actually doesn't even tell you how to get back there. So weirdly, to get out of this, I now have to, and I can't do this easily on a keyboard as far as I'm aware, I'm sure I just don't know the right buttons to press. I have to press back on my controller enough times that I get back here. But there isn't a exit scan from what I can find. So now my playlist has been created, right? And so the user needs to know that they can now come here. And if I'd just chosen to scan one file, then one thing would be in here, or being added if there's an existing playlist. And for me, that's quite a lot of friction and steps already, right? And so then I need to make the judgment, oh, right, now I need to choose to play the game. And then if I'm running it for the first time, I can't do this because I have set up cores. I don't even know if it will allow me to do that if there's not a core selected. So the user then has to make the leap that they need to set a core and so on and so forth, right? So I'm going to switch back to the presentation. And that's kind of what I've tried to cover in this screen here, okay, is that kind of general flow. If we then move on, so when the user, let's say the user's done that and successfully managed to navigate that, it's a smaller task, but likely the one that they're probably going to want to do a lot, is when they want to play a game, or play a ROM, or use a ROM, there's still quite a substantial number of steps that need to be taken. And if you're a novice user, there's potentially still a whole bunch of pitfalls that you can run into along the way until you actually start learning the right way to do things. So again, the user wants to play a particular game and they already have imported in and it already exists in a playlist. So they run RetroArch, as we can see here. They're taken to that main menu again, which seems redundant, to be honest. They then have to exit out of the main menu to go to the sidebar because they're automatically within the main menu. And then they have to choose the correct playlist, which is fine. Let's assume they can manage to do that. From within the playlist, they have to choose a game, and then they get taken to the game menu. And the game menu has a list of options. The first one, which is highlighted, is run, and provided everything has been successfully set up, activating or pressing or entering, activating, the run button will run the game, right? Now, there's a whole bunch of other options there, and some of them, I've listed them as partial red herrings because usually the player or user shouldn't really need to touch many of these. And so by presenting them with kind of equal visual priority and hierarchy as run, it's maybe causing a lot of users to look at that screen and go, oh, should I care about some of these things? Is that something I want to change? And we don't necessarily want to get rid of your ability to change any of those things, but by having them at the same visual priority or visual hierarchy, I think it creates a series of like unanswered red herrings in the novice's head, right? That they probably just don't need to think about. So I'm going to jump over again, and we'll try and go through that example, right? So we can see here, the user just boots into RetroArch. They're taken to this screen again, and they want to play a game, right? So they've got to back out, scroll down, go into the playlist, find the game that they want to play, click on the game, and then click run, and the game will run, right? And these options here are not relevant 99.9% of the time, or I'm exaggerating, but a large percentage of the time that the user comes here, right? All of these options are things that they probably maybe occasionally want to do, or very rarely want to do, but run is a very high priority item. And so my feeling at this stage is that I think it would be a good way for us to find how can you just run from this screen, and then how can we add a different button or toggle that takes us to the remainder of this screen? Because it removes a step, and it already makes the app a lot more usable and convenient for a user. Now I know there'll be people like, well, you're only pressing a menu twice, blah, 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 but every time you go in there, it adds up. And it also reinforces, I think, too much to the user that this app is about changing settings, right? Renaming, removing, setting core associations, rather than just getting on and playing the games. And I think little changes like that would make a big difference to novice users. We've already got a section at the bottom which is OK back search. On relevant screens, we could have an options button, right? Where maybe it's square on a PlayStation controller, or the left-hand circle on that Switch-like controller would bring up this screen, and just pressing X on the game would just launch the game, right? For example. Cool, so I'm going to go back to the presentation. So as we can see here, this flow kind of summarizes a lot of that. And then the final flow that I've done is the choose core one, because it's likely also one that users are going to see a lot, because RetroArch doesn't automatically, as far as I'm aware, choose any cores for the user, so they have to get presented with that. Now this is an interesting one in that depending on how you've imported content, and depending on what the first thing you do is, you can come to the core screen in very different ways. And it makes sense because you possibly do want to go in and just go bang, 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 download a bunch of, I know what cores I want, bang, 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 download them all, and then scan content, playlist made, job done, right? And if you know what you're doing, that's very effective. But for most core, like novice users, my suspicion is that's not the route that they would take, and the route that they would take is adding content first, and then try to play content, and then be presented with a choice of cores. So either way, I've tried to kind of map that. So again, you want to, I need to rename that bubble, sorry. You want to choose a core, or assign a core to a particular game so that it can run. So again, the user has to launch RetroArch. Again, they'll be presented with the main menu. And this is where it depends how they want to tackle this problem, and depends what they're actually trying to do, right? So if it is genuinely play a game and they've not set up any cores, then it will be runs RetroArch, main menu, sidebar, and then the most sensible option, maybe, is to choose a playlist and then edit that playlist so that you can choose a core, and then you get presented with the list of options for the core, right? Another way of doing it is to choose the game, and then you'll get taken to the game menu, and then you can set the core association there. I think I might tweak some of these arrows actually, I'm not sure they're correct. And then, hopefully the core runs, and then you can run the game. The other way of doing it is you can obviously come in, you can go to the main menu, you can go to the online updater, which is not immediately obvious that this is what that does. You then can go to the core downloader, and then you'll get taken to the same option of cores. Obviously, you can't run a game from that screen, but you can download the cores that you want from that screen. There's a lot going on here that I think for advanced users makes a lot of sense. I think my goal for novice users would be try to find a way where there's a core flow that we want them to go through when launch, import games, builds playlist, and then start assigning cores, and then I can now play a game, right? If there was, try and find a way to make that very staged process is my kind of instinct on where that's heading. So I'll walk through this flow as well. So there's a few ways that this can be done. So I'll start as if we'd started in the main menu. So in terms of adding cores, and one of the ways the user can do it is obviously choose this online updater. Now, it's potentially confusing initially when you get here because there's nothing in this section that mentioned anything to do with cores. As we've already talked about in one of the previous videos and part of the slide deck, was about metaphors, right? And the central metaphors that we kind of came up with, or one of them, was that core and cores are a fairly central metaphor that we want to be educating the user about, right? Playlists are also another one, and as are games, etc., etc. And so it's important that if we want to make sure that these metaphors are taught and maintained cognizantly by the user, that we actually use them consistently and that we reinforce them. And so this is one of the first places where I think it would be a good idea, in a minimal change kind of way, to be at least mentioning cores, right? Download add-ons, cores, components, and content for RetroArch could be a very good change there, right? So then the user can come in here and then they can see core downloader, right? And they can then click on that and they get taken to a list. Now, I've talked at length on the RetroArch Discord about this, but my feeling is that a good change to this list would be, at the very least, ways to filter and sort it, and ways to add flags, for want of a better description, to each core so that we can do that in a very neutral fashion, but talking about some sort of features that are important, generally speaking, to RetroArch. So it shouldn't be things like this is a buggy mess, right? That is not a flag that we should ever have, but a flag that's potentially runs 90+% of games on the platform. Now, I don't know if that's an achievable one, but something like that would be good. We can find a better way to name it. But if you could then search by that, it means then, because you see here, like there's 2 Amstrad. I've got nothing, I don't do any Amstrad emulation. I've got no idea about Amstrad emulation. I don't know which one to pick. And maybe both of them are equally as good, right? And that's great. But there's also a chance that one of them's more maintained and more runs more of the library, and one isn't, right? And when we get down into Arcade, you can see I've installed 3 different versions of Arcade here. I didn't know anything about MAME emulation until recently, and it's been a fun journey, in inverted commas. But this is one of the biggest red herrings. There's a couple of other platforms as well, but you can see there's loads of Arcade listings here. A novice user, I don't think, should have to do substantial Google searches necessarily to figure all of this out, right? Now, I realize some of it's tied to like how they got their games, etc., etc. But I think if we could filter this list and the user could filter it, that would definitely be beneficial. And my suggestion would be potentially to enforce very quickly on the user that it can be filtered by having nothing visible and an information screen that says, please choose a filter. And so that way we can have some filters that are immediately obvious to novice users and then ones that are more granular for other users. But anyway, whether or not that change is made, we have to acknowledge that this screen is a very difficult screen for non-experts to understand how to make a valid or good choice. So in addition to here, we can also get to this screen by navigating to a playlist and then managing it. You can see down at the bottom, there's a button for manage. So if I click manage, I can also choose the default core there. So if I click on that, that will bring up only the cores that I've downloaded. In fact, I'm not actually sure there's a way to download a core from here, which is an interesting side journey, right? Is that if I don't have any cores, I'm not actually sure I can download a core from here. And then you can also do it here. So if for some reason one game doesn't run on a particular core, but does on another, and maybe 75% of your library is totally fine on that on a core, core A, but this game only runs on core B, and then I can download that core, and I've already set that here as well, right? Again, so we'll get back and update actually, I think, this user journey, in that it looks to me that the only way to download cores is through the core downloader. And so what that means is, one, we're kind of failing the user very early on because they have to take a leap to go in here. They have to then know which cores to download. It potentially would be a good idea if it doesn't, I can't tell at the moment, I've got an install already and it's a long time since I set it up, but I don't think there's any way it prompts you to download a core once you've created a playlist. And so coming back to the presentation, this is the end of the user journey section. And you can see here, I've spent a lot of time today trying to get to grips mapping this, and I'm still not quite getting it right. So I will update it. But that goes to show how easy it is for a user to kind of get lost or make a mistake in the interface, right? And I think what's really important for us to acknowledge is, if we want to improve the user experience in RetroArch, it's not just about, and it shouldn't be about, removing features. That's not what I'm trying to suggest at all. It's about looking at the feature set that we have and trying to find good ways of reprioritizing the flow, reprioritizing and sometimes rearranging how the information is presented so that users can make more sensible choices and decisions. Cool. So that's the end of the presentation for me today. Thank you for watching, and I'm pretty confident now that in the next video is going to be me talking over some Figma designs. So I'm going to try and take the UI as it stands and either make some small nips and tucks to try and present a way that we could massage the current UI into something that maybe makes more sense, and or, depending on how I find that, massage it into something a little bit more slightly different or slightly better presented. So we'll see how that goes. What I probably will do is start with the former and talk through why I've ended in the latter, if that happens. So thanks very much for watching. Hope the slide decks make sense based on the video. And as always, if you've got any comments or feedback, please add them onto the slide deck, and please also hit me up in the RetroArch Discord as well.